Thank you, Maha. Thank you all for having found the time to be present in this online lecture and hear what I have to say about those things that are happening in our times. I know, don't I know Maha, and I know Jonathan. I don't know Jiho, but now I'm gonna challenge you and I'm gonna perhaps make you angry with what I'm saying, but I will nonetheless proceed onto this. I suggest the following. My talk will have a lot of questions along the way, and some may be a little bit difficult even to comprehend. But if we stop for every one of these, I will never arrive at the final message of mine, which is that AI is a much more complex achievement than it's usually being debated in the literature. And I want to make clear how much more complex or subtle it is. And I want to arrive at this message, but if we stay at all the details, I conjecture that I will not be able to reach there. So what I suggest is that you stop and ask me only clarifying questions and spare your questions, your anger or frustration for the end of this. Okay? So let's see. Yeah. So my research interest that Maha already spoke, but I didn't know how the public will be here, the audience, so I still thought of presenting these slides. That my research interest, I think most of you know, is broadly the organizational and economic changes that are associated with digitization, and most recently with the diffusion of data in our societies. And when I say about these things, I mean new practices, but also economic forms, like, for instance, platform firms, which are particular types of firms that didn't exist before in history. And such practices or forms that I find increasingly that they could not exist apart from data. And the functions, the many functions, I will analyze some of them that data perform for experts and for organizations. So, but a persistent theme in this scholarship of mine has been, Maha mentioned this, but let me say the ideal of, a persistent interest about producing ideas that could help us understand the bigger picture of things, not some small change in a particular organization, which I don't mean this is bad. It's not part of my interest. My interest is to look a little bit more about the economy and society and how management is a driving force for many social and economic changes. That was my so, and I have theorized this. I have also done alone or with my colleagues empirical research on this. You see also some of these ideas are very well, I think I'm entitled to say very well captured in our recent book with Christina Laimo, which is called Data Rules, Reinventing the Market Economy, which is exactly draws on our empirical research in 2-3 different types of contexts, but it's not an empirical book, but uses this mostly as an illustrations to make the fundamental argument on how data is a driving force of economic change. I may need to come back to this, and I'm gonna speak about some of the ideas of the book throughout my talk. I stay here for the moment and I move forward. So the seminar talk today, I will make an effort to think, as you saw in my title, which is slightly different than the one perhaps Maha shared, is a brief or an in-conscience history on the role of data in our economy and society. So I will make a few very quick and dirty claims, if you like, on how data are not just the outcome of digitization, that they have preceded digitization in the form of paper-based documents. We all know of this, and how in this form, in this general form of paper-based documents, but also in connection with a variety of expert practices, has been an important vehicle for control and coordination. And then computerization came in the early stages of information technology. It expanded some of these ideas. And then I'm going to say a few fundamental ideas about digitization on a large scale. And as I mentioned very quickly before, I'm going to link this to the advent of platforms as diffuse organizational arrangements, and also shifting in different practices of data of linked to value creation. I will stop for a while to think about these fundamental changes and say something underlying commonalities in both the project of control and coordination and the project of digitization, as I will call it. I know these are kind of dirty words, very general. And I say some underlying ideas behind both projects before I move to give you an account of how whatever has happened is a precondition for current AI, and also make, against the background of these developments, an effort to describe what I think AI is and how AI research will be conducted. So, but I think it's important to make some fundamental notes, or make you clear about some fundamental assumptions of mine ahead of this talk, in the outset of this talk. And this is the idea that of data that I, and also together with Christina Alaimo, have written most of these latest articles of mine over the last decade, more or less, the idea of data not as statistical entities, the idea of data not as economic resources, and certainly the idea of data not as bit strings. We understand data as something on the top of these fundamental qualities, and which we call data as artifacts of cognition and knowledge. We understand data as perception filters and instruments of cognition. And this is a particular take on data. I've seen some people have done that, and this is something you also encounter it across some great sociologists or social science thinkers from Knorr Centina or Desrosiers, Alain Desrosiers, a follower of Foucault, a friend of Foucault and then a follower, wrote this fundamental book, The Politics of Large Numbers, which I think is a book that everybody would read, in which data are obviously ways of setting up a world. They are not just data points the statistician can only handle. They are obviously data points. But with these data points, you can do a number of things. Therefore, this fundamental take on data as more than statistical data points, bit strings, or even economic resources is fundamental for understanding what I'm trying to say. I hope to have the opportunity, as my talk is moving ahead, to clarify this, but some quick illustration of this is how data has been used for understanding ourselves. This has been captured in those debates about the quantified self some time ago. These debates still go on. how we use data from various things, including this clock and many other to monitor our bodies and our understanding of who we are and what we do, how well we are. But data has been also used in industrial platforms. Industrial platforms could not exist without all these abilities to gather important data about the functioning of machines and use this data to produce what is called predictive diagnostics and maintenance practices, and also the production of services that didn't exist in the history of manufacturing before. The same can be told about social media. Social media without the Facebook Live would never have existed. That doesn't say that social media is only data, neither that industrial platforms are only data, but it does say that data has been a critical component for setting up the worlds of social media platforms, of industrial platforms, and of supporting a number of social and economic practices. This is therefore important to have in mind as I keep talking. My or our own understanding, if I also include Christina with me, is of data as sociocultural entities. And by this, we mean entities created by human communities to achieve cognitive and communicative targets and functions. Okay? So let me look a few very quickly on this, what I call a concise instrumental history of data. So data has been, and this is important to notice because many people will tend to think that data is the outcome of the digital age. And because the digital age, this data in the digital age are being created almost by default, and every time we do something, it's being recorded and some sort of data is being created. It's very important to say that data pre-existed the digital age, and they played a very important role in the in record keeping and in bookkeeping, which is one form of record keeping. There are other forms of record keeping, so accounting, and be used in history specifically of what we call industrial age or modernity, if you want a sociological term. They have been used in abundance to measure or obtain an understanding, an assessment of costs, resources, and benefits across products and markets and time intervals, quarterly, annually, over the years. And without data, it's hard to obtain an understanding, a detailed understanding of the operations of an organization and the ways organizations function. In this respect, data has been an important instrument for producing a wide organizational visibility, if you like, or legibility for ultimately the purpose of controlling and coordinating organizational operations. These ideas are landmark studies here, which some of them very quickly that I mentioning here that have important studies that have had a far-reaching impact in several fields of what I call administrative sciences more generally. And Alfred Sandler's book, The Visible Hand, The Managerial Revolution in American Business. Alfred Sandler was a professor of economic history at Harvard. He says a lot of things in this fantastic book. But a few fundamental things we say is the importance of internal data for setting up those business organizations we now call corporations. And without the data without this data, these managerial functions and these enduring institutional entities we call corporations would never have existed in the form they came to exist in middle and late industrial age and the early information age. He gives many examples. Some of them is about operating ratios in accounting, like solidity, solvency, in which you compare different types of resources in organization, including cash, to produce an idea about where you are and how healthy or unhealthy you may be in your operations. No data, no corporations. I can summarize these ideas of Chandler here. And the same ideas has been also mediated by James Benninger's classic sociological now book, The Control Revolution in 1986, where Benninger treats basically information and communication technologies and the data they produce as fundamental instruments for tracking the operations of firms and organizations in the large national markets. As you left particular context in small geographical regions, the need to coordinate the operations of organizations, these expanded markets from California in America to New York, or from Maine to Arizona, you had to use these technologies to achieve this kind of visibility and control. I think the most compelling story about this is being told with Zuboff, by contrast to Benninger and Zuboff, and Chandler. Zuboff introduces also a lot of behavioral considerations in her account. She gives I think, a very thorough understanding of how the spread of computers, computerization and informatization have come to create another type of organization, which he mentions in several ways. Informating, it has several terms. And some of them, I won't stay now in details, but some of them, let me know, are being masterfully described in what I think is one of the most evocative chapters in the history of administrative sciences, which is called Mastering the Electronic Text. How that text, data, and not mostly an information, expand how it's being produced, that there is no author behind that text, how it grows, how it engulfs in operation at the same time as being engulfed by several operations. It's a very thoughtful chapter. All of this together gives you an idea that data in both the industrial age and early computer age has been used in abundance as instruments of control and communication. Then I think by the, depends on how you put the historical borderline, came the idea, came further computerization. I'm sorry, I have to. How computerization enhanced some of the paper-based practices, it expanded and enhanced them, and how later, through large-scale digitization, we arrived at what we have all experienced, the evolution of the internet in 1990s, and then by the mid of the first decade of this century, the emergence of social media, which are particular forms of use. That's how I see, that's how we see them. Social media is particular forms of using, of engineering social interaction and making money out of it. So these are some very quick and concise descriptions of what happened and the role that data plays in this context, and it's fundamental for these ideas, for these developments to occur. It has been crucial that some things been shaped in very particular ways, and you had to. The internet could never be arrived without considerable standardization of data, and that enables, so to say, different computer machines to produce this data, but also share this data through standardized protocols, through formats, particular formats. And as this process went on, data on the top of being standardized had been homogenized, which is a slightly different term for describing basically the syntactic data composition of dealing with different social orders or different social practices and media outputs like text, image, and sound, which in modern, nowadays this is evident, but it may not have been as evident in the 90s when these processes took really off. How such different products, text, image, and sound that previously required completely different technologies, like the typewriter, the image, the film, and the sound, the gramophone, how these different technologies has been unified in these things we have in front of us, the laptop computers and telephones. This homogenization of data brings the reduction of many cultural forms into data that then can be treated, analyzed, and used in a variety of ways, which should be, I hope to be able to discuss in a little while. But what I want, therefore, to say here, and that's the bottom line of these ideas, is that all these developments, data emerge as universal, if you want to say agnostic. It's not universal, but it's made universal, or context-free medium of communication in which critically machines begin to play a vital role. And when I say machines begin to play a vital role, I mean mostly data processing as the backbone of human contact, and how as the backbone of data processing in which, human contact occurs solely at the entry and exit points, by which I mean that the data may be produced by a human, but once put into machine, the machine makes the processing. That's how databases, for instance, work. And then humans receive this at the other end, which is the exit, and they can do a number of things with this data. But the processing, nonetheless, the retrieval and processing of this data occurs through automatic ways. That's why computing technologies and digitization have been developed. So I think if we stop for a while and reflect upon this broad development, first the production of massive paper documents, then early computerization, and then digitization, I think we are allowed to infer that these two fundamental things have happened, which I call two separations, for these things to be able to take off. And the first separation that is common for paper-based documents and from computerization is what I call the separation from data from context. Data, either in paper-based or in early computer systems cannot be created unless you separate them from the things they refer to, right? This necessarily implies that I can create a record of accounting in a particular context, but this separation means that I put the things that happen in this context, the transactions, in another medium, which is the accounting, bookkeeping medium, which then can be carried across that context. In another context, over several years, over several decades, if you like, and do a number of things with this accounting record. This is common in, I say, in paper-based document and in early computerization. In order to create data, you have inevitably to separate data from what they refer to. This we call simply representing. And the second fundamental separation, which you may create you perhaps some confusion because of the terminology, probably. But you will understand me because the context here or the meaning of what I'm trying to say is also different. The second separation is data from sense or semantic content or meaning, which means, and I'm sorry, I have a mistake here, I should be representing. Yeah? And this is the foundations of digital computing that I mentioned just in the previous slide. Unless the machine is being given the task to work on data that may have been generated by humans and can be interpreted at the other end, once being produced, processed by humans, they've been given the opportunity that we have constructed, in other words, clever enough machines to do some part of this information processing. And this is the foundations of computing. I don't want to stay much on this, but Shannon and Weaver's fundamental theory of communication is that computers are syntactic machines that deal with syntactic tokens through mechanical, standardized, and technology enacted ways. They have the encoding and decoding at the end of this process, but the processing is done by the machines in the middle, right? So, and I can produce, therefore, this table as a way of summarizing what I was saying so far. So what you see here is, I mean, it's a way of summarizing these ideas. I have three things which are the requirements, what functional implications they have, and what objective and application areas they have been applied to. So the first separation, which is the separation, let me say, of paper-based document, creates the separation of context from context or referent. The action is the one of representing, and we have then the creation of paper-based data records. In the second separation, we have decoupling from sense, meaning we want to call it or semantic content. We represent, but in additionally, we standardize and homogenize data to give the opportunity to machines to deal with them. Functional implications that correspond to paper-based records are digital databases. And some areas, or objectives, if you like, or application areas you have here. In the first case, it is archives, document repositories and libraries, the standard information, data and information technologies of the industrial age. And in the second column, which is the second separation, you have automated data processing, critically automated retrieval systems. You can input a word and get the data you want, still everywhere. And I will also include data analytics into this. So this is a summary of of, let me check the time. I have to move a little bit quicker forward. So the organizational implications of this data shift in data practices and technologies has been the advent of platforms as diffused organizational forms, and I speak of platforms as platform firms. I need to make this distinction very clear, in which I think data in most of platforms, or the overwhelming variety of platforms, are pervasive media through which platforms organize the front stage, which is the interaction with maybe the participants, the human users, where they may be consumers or customers or clients or participants, as in social media. They use them to organize backstage work through databases and new forms of databasing, like the Hadoop and these kinds of things. And they use them to support new forms of value creation, where they use the data to produce a variety of services, like recommendations, audiences. I'll say a few about this later on. So platforms are a key medium for managing distributed entities. And some of these ideas we summarize very well with Christina in our organization studies article, paper, Managing by Data, which we show how music is being organized, made sense of, listened, and acted upon through completely different things than was the case ahead of these new technologies. We analyze one of the first social media platforms for music, content platforms, the Last.fm. But also in playing this role, data allow platforms to become global actors working on 24/7, interruptedly on a global scale, and they are able, therefore, to address the problem of decentralization and critically decentralization in ways that older companies have never been able to do them. They use data, or let me say that they could not done this without data. Some of these ideas are also captured very nicely in Anne Helmond's article, The Platformization of the Web, and shows how important data is for this project of re-centralizing, which is another way of saying use data to master and colonize a much bigger space of social and economic life. So out of this, we think comes also several important implications for expert knowing and expert practices. In the old regime, if you allow me to use that word, data usually served particular types of knowledge in particular domains. We sometimes refer to this with the name domain knowledge. For instance, if you perform in engineering, you needed data of a very particular type. If you performed healthcare, if you were in healthcare, you both produced and needed data of very particular type. The same with accounting. And in most of these traditional circumstances, data were servants, if you allow me to use that word, of the knowledge objects. They didn't play any other role but providing the necessary oil, if I'm to use this word, the necessary oil for achieving the targets of expert practices for facilitating expert practices. And the fundamental change that has occurred through these processes I've been trying to describe very quickly with my previous slides is something that I and Christina call unbundling, where data no longer serve existing domain knowledge objects and domain knowledge practices, but become an independent source for knowledge, for services, for new types of practices. As it happens, for instance, the most extreme example is that you may use data from social interaction on social media for policing purposes and criminality detection. Criminality detection needed very particular type of data before. And now you can also use data from social media in a variety of ways to achieve something which would have most probably been unthinkable before. The same can be said about credit scores and reputation scores and a number of other things. I won't stay much on this, guys, as the time is moving quickly forward, but this basically tells the story that data become an independent, or you want to call quasi-independent, because this dependencies, they are relative. There's a continuum. They are relative terms, but becomes a relatively, let me say, independent source of value and innovation, and it can be used as a primary source of knowledge development, as in business analytics, as in market dynamics, and also a diffuse medium for a product or service development like predictive diagnostic, personalized services, audience and targeted advertising and marketing, insurance services, and the like. This, guys, concludes this first part of my talk. And I have a summary here. That's what I try to say with all these peregrinations, intellectual peregrinations of mine, that data are media of cognition, knowledge, and communication. They slice the world in ways we want them to slice, and in some ways in the ways they slice them, because they means that they are dependent on one another. But they are media of cognition, knowledge, and communication. That's to juxtapose from the fundamental idea that are statistical data points or bit strings. The diffusion of data in organizations and society impact the patterns. Sorry for the mistakes, it should be the double T here, the patterns by which we mark, understand, and perform the world. And these developments carry far-reaching structural implications, by which I mean new organizational forms, and have also important consequences, another small mistake here, for the pursuit and exercise of expert knowledge. Now, I want to use this knowledge, which I think is absolutely important, and you can't talk about AI if you don't know these things, or if you ignore these things. And this is a big challenge on how to use some of this knowledge when you study either machine learning and object recognition, or what is now being abundantly called Gen AI. So data are, we all know, key elements behind the development of AI-based systems and applications. And it's an important, a vital element, both in object recognition, which was the fundamental technology of machine learning a few years ago, but also in translation and content creation, which are applications of computing that stem from natural language processing and the automation of natural language processing, and in training robots. In all these things, data are fundamental. Without data, you have none of these technologies. And without the right type of data, you cannot have any of these technologies. But if you stop for a while and reflect about how AI may be said to differ from what I described previously, paper-based document and automated data processing, I think a quick way of, or dirty even way of saying this, is that AI represents a technology of data interpretation. Within the AI system is built all the procedures, the mechanized procedures and techniques, not only for processing data, but for interpreting the data and the referent or meaning this data may have about life, about one or another context or particular situation. I produce, therefore, this table, which summarizes but also expands the idea I have presented to you so far, where I present a third separation, and the third separation is now not from referent or sense and semantic content, but from the very process of data interpretation that previously were the exclusive prerogative, the exclusive task of human experts and expert knowledge, whether legal, accountants, medical doctors, or whatever profession you may want to imagine. So I say they produce enclaves because the whole data interpretation cannot be mapped by one AI application. So each AI usually focuses on a particular data interpretation step. But what is that distinguishes AI from previous ways of generating data to control, handle, and perform reality? So on the top, there are four of the other distinctions we had previously representing, standardizing, and homogenizing. AI brings forward the data interpreting. And the AI-based techniques are techniques of data handling, inference, and content management. And some fundamental applications of these you find early in recommender systems, and now increasingly in what we call object recognition, including image and voice recognition, and in generative AI, in particular in the creation of large language models. Now, if this is the case, then we have to think of the prevailing two narratives of AI in slightly different terms. But let me first summarize very quickly these. So these are the two. There are several variants, of course, but these are the two fundamental AI narratives that prevail, both in the literature but also in the public debate. The one is a narrative that comes from economics, and is predominantly the narrative of substitution. AI is just a technological device of rationalization. The same gospel as with the industrial revolution. AI will steal your job, and if it is a low-skilled job, the chances are that you will be replaced by a machine. The other narrative, which is the narrative of IS and organization studies, and which is not quantitative, because the first of them is quantitative by and large, tells a slightly different and in many respects a much more sensible story, but still very incomplete for reasons I will try to explain very quickly. Now I have 5-10 minutes more, Maha, yeah. So the narrative of augmentation tells us the story that these systems of data interpretation are in place, but they will not replace humans. They will replace perhaps some of the operations of humans, but they will be ultimately dependent on these human experts. And what we have instead is the development of hybrid forms of expertise whereby AI, in some fundamental sense, is helping human experts to achieve their tasks. And there's a big literature on that. There are several variants of that literature, but I think I am entitled to say that this is the fundamental message. So, what I think is a problem on this, and including the second one, which speaks more to me, of course, because of my experience and also my own understanding of the world. AI is entirely black boxed and the role of data overlooked. There are very little of how organizational reality is being refurbished, reshuffled, and remade by the introduction of AI. They are also reductionist, as most of so-called interpretive work has been all over the years, Maha. I'm sorry to say this. It's reductionist, a focus on individual experts. In the best case, a few experts, but only treated as individuals, not as communities. Seldom as communities, you will have to say yours, Maha. But also is reductionist in the sense that it tells us very little about what I said before also, how AI refigures the fabric of organizational operations. It brings new data, new tasks, some other tasks are going, some communication channels are remade. It's not that you plug in an AI and then you have an effect in the form of augmentation of human expertise. That is too reductionist to believe in this. And this is enormously reificationist. I have heard terms, sorry, Maha, algorithmic management. What the hell does that mean? Algorithmic societies. You reduce a society to a small calculative device that is called algorithm. Treating algorithms as deus ex machina is a big problem today. And part of this is because all things I said are completely ignored. And no historical awareness exists about data, perception, cognition, and institutional forms. These are all tightly linked together, and they have to be reflected upon. So you may ask me, so what? Yeah, that's what I've been saying, guys, the so what. AI needs unpacking because it reweaves the bond between perception, cognition, and action. These are very subtle and complex things. We need to unpack AI. We need to unpack deep learning. You don't need to be an engineer, but for God's sake, you need to know what deep learning is when you talk about it. What do you need to know about deep learning? You need to know the fundamentals, how they encode objects, how they learn, what data they use, and what procedures they use to make some inferences. These are fundamentals. Otherwise, you call this algorithm and it's finished. You can't get anywhere with this. unpacking more generally, I would say, than the method by which AI redefines cognition and knowledge and arrives at recommendations or decisions. Doing research on AI in organization needs, therefore, to investigate how AI reestablishes the connection between evidence produced by the data or evidence of the data AI uses to establish the connection between that evidence, expert decision, and organizational operations. And some augmentation literature goes some way towards doing some of it. But in general, the general picture, I would say, is rather discouraging. Too much jargon, too easy welcome jumping, too much fashion adoption, this algorithmic blah, blah, blah. And I would say we need empirical research. And here is one message I have to give you guys, all of you, known you, Maha, Jonathan, and also Doncha for many years. We need to produce empirical research that has strong awareness of the empirical object we study, not at the expense of that object. AI is far too important to deal only with the handle of it. We need to open the black box, and we need also to understand, in other words, that the real is bigger than the empirical. The interviews you take and the documents you analyze is not the whole world. There is a world that can be reflected and is real beyond that. Realists call this the real, and I am one of them, an informed realist. I have said farewell to constructivism from many, many years ago. Of the way it's been practiced, constructivism and realism are not necessarily at odds. What I'm saying also here, we need to move beyond the study of the interaction order, which is very important. One fantastic writer that does that is Knorr-Cetina. She uses the interaction order, but she goes much beyond that. In 1999, he discusses how the interactions of physicists, and biologists construct new forms of interaction, what she calls the global laboratory. This needs to be reflected upon. And she also launches a huge attack against the so-called action perspective. She, not I. I've been always. This is important. We've reached on the other end, and we have surmised all the critical things that happen on a more abstract terms that have been sacrificed, and no one is talking. And if you talk, you are called determinist. But what the hell are you talking about? What determinism are you to speak? Are you so simple? And finally, part of what I've been saying is that my AI, if it is the way I described it, linked to data linked to technologies that produce, generate, and aggregate them, on all of these shared with particular applications of AI, they construct an infrastructure and an ecology. And this needs to be rethought. It needs to be part of the explanation. Different technology, different layers, different path dependencies, a variety of management practice, distributed social roles and positions in organization. Not everybody does the same thing. There are layers. They are different knowledges. There are different roles. There are conditions, economic conditions for success or failure, and inbuilt inertia in social systems. All this needs to be taken into account when we analyze AI. We cannot go into a particular organization and study only how the medical doctors of that hospital interacted with the technology and arrive at this conclusion, guys. Is not possible. So I'm finished, is the last slide. Need for reorientation is my message, guys. And these things are too serious and need to be done better. There's some good work out there, but much remains to be done. We need to have an understanding in the long history of techniques of data generation, aggregation, and interpretation with which AI is entangled. And we need to have also an understanding of the way AI recasts cognition, recasts data management and data interpretation.
Hello from California, everyone.
Yeah.
Early morning here. Nice to see you, Jannis.
Thank you.
So I just had a sort of an incidental question along the way. I can follow pretty well everything you say, as I'm largely familiar with it. But my question was an observation with regard to what seems to be happening today is that data are also being weaponized in politics, weaponized. And how should we understand how we have arrived at this in the context of everything you have to say?
I don't know, to be honest, Bert. I don't have studied politics in particular, which is one of my limitations. But I think if we take stock of my definition of data as artifacts of cognition and knowledge that are closely linked with human objectives and pursuit or social, then it's not a very long step. It is in some way a long step, but it's fundamental then for saying that data never copy the world exactly, but they are instruments of making that world. And one fundamental instrument of making that world is politics and also what you describe as weaponization. But that needs to be studied in all its particular details, I say. But what I'm saying is not at odds with what you describe and can be clearly united. I don't know whether I'm giving you an answer. You may want to elaborate yourself.
Well, I do think that what you have to say lends itself to talking about the weaponization of data in a way in which it hasn't really been talked about in most of the everyday coverage of weaponization. And it would be rather interesting to do this. And so I don't have any more background in politics than you do. But ignorance is never an obstacle to
exactly.
They're trying to pursue further understanding. So I guess I would like to provoke you into thinking a little bit about this, and I will just leave it at that. But maybe others that are following the news these days that think that politics has actually become rather important to us. I'm actually somewhat sorry to say from where I sit relative to you folks. So just a thought in the context of what you have to say today. Thank you.
Yeah, very well taken.
Jiho's next. So Jiho, would you like to go?
Yes, my question was probably I have missed this during the talk, but I found like the first part where you talked about the implications of data for control and coordination within organizations as kind of disconnected with the latter part where you're talking about the impact of AI and what's the implication of AI for like future research on organizing and organizations. I just wondered, like, could you tell us again, like, how you see, like, the how AI will influence the coordination and control like these problems within organizations? Thank you.
Yes. I think one immediate response to this disconnection you mentioned is to look back at the table, which I think provides a sort of continuity of these practices, of the practices of control and coordination, the practices I referred to then as platformization, digitization, expert knowledge unbundling, and the like. In some ways, all of these are related. Every practice relies on a technology that does something different. And AI, in some way, builds on all these four previous stages. You can't have AI without having significant control and coordination practices in place, without having significant technologies, organizations, and expert practices in which data are being daily mobilized for control and communication, and then being reused and reinterpreted in the context of current AI. So that is a very quick answer, but that's should be my reply to you. Once more, I think you should have a look at this table. It may help a little bit see that there are, of course, discontinuities between each one of the stages, but also some fundamental, also underlying similarities.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Professor
But
Kavanagh.
AI, just to comment, AI is still a different beast. That should be clear in my understanding, my description of AI as a complex practice of data interpretation. It's a complex technique of data, rather than a practice, complex technique of technology of data interpretation.
Great. Professor Kavanagh, if I'm saying your name correctly, which I apologize if I'm not.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jannis. You're very, very interesting. A few questions that I posed, and they're kind of three questions, so they're kind of linked. But your talk about homogenizing data reminded me of the discussion in time studies about the way in which time has been homogenized, so that universal time, and so you've this practice of homogenizing time. But you've also, in parallel to this practice of homogenizing time, you've got a multiplicity of times so you have a heterogenizing logic going on at the same time. So I was wondering, should you have a heterogenizing logic of data, because you've got the massive production of data at the same time as the homogenizing of data. So the massive production of diverse data. And hence I thought, would it make sense to maybe think a bit about categorizing types of data? Because you have a lot of data, you're presenting data in some ways as potent and as independent and powerful, but a lot of data is just rubbish. So you've potent, at the very minimum, you've got potent data and you've got rubbish. And the third related point would be in terms of categorizing data, there's also the process of producing data, of translating data, of maintaining data. So to take a more processual approach to data than what you've taken.
Yeah, I think certainly a lot of things have been missing in this concise history of data I've been given. I had this particular task of bringing some of these ideas for speaking about AI and about how I find current research on AI limited in many important respects. So that was my major purpose. Now, if you enter particular details, of not necessarily organizations, but healthcare sectors or industrial sectors, as for instance, Bowker and Starr have done, or some of the things that Bert Johnson has done in his life. You need to enter more into the details of the process you describe, and therefore describe how data are being extended, being deleted, being complemented, cleansed, made different. Certainly, this is part of the explanation. And if you study also particular AI applications in one or several organizations, and even in a particular sector, you have to deal with some of these processual things you mentioned. But the whole picture I'm attempting to describe, which I think is very important for conducting empirical research of the type you mentioned, this doesn't need these details at the moment. This will be complemented by particular studies performed in particular contexts. What I have therefore been said is the need to understand how data is a pervasive medium, a pervasive resource through which many of the things we confront in our daily lives are being made, and therefore is part of the AI project. And this needs to be given more attention than it has received so far. So this was my fundamental purpose with this. In particular studies, but also in connection with Christina, who have performed, we have gone down into the details of some of the things you mentioned, because this needs to be done, even though we never have taken what is being called an action perspective, by which I understand not what probably you understand, but what I have seen in practice is a focus on individuals. This is not an action perspective. This is something which resembles more what economists call methodological individualism, really, because the community and practice component of knowledge, of technology, of ways of acting is being overlooked, to say the least.
Very good.
Please feel free to just raise your hand, guys. Anyone who has a question.
Hi, Jannis. I don't have a question, but and I'm not supposed to be talking about my own research in your research seminar, but I'm going to do it anyway. But I apologize. But Angelo, who's in this call too, and I spent a lot of time with scientific entities and organizations, and what I've learned through time is they don't talk about data; they talk about energy, right? And so for them, there's a long process between measuring different kinds of energies and arriving at something they would call data. So the data really is, they talk about signals and mediums and energies. They don't talk about data that much because data don't exist in nature. And so what's kind of fascinating is speaking that history of you mentioned Norsetina and the history of instrumentalism, but that philosophy of how data are constructed either politically or technically through instruments and theories and so forth. And so that's kind of one part of where our thinking on this is, and I think it would agree with most, if I've understood you correctly, it would agree with your perspective, right? But then the importantly is what's interesting in how scientists generate data is whether they're doing it deeply situated in a paradigm or not, in more of a machine learning type of paradigm or something in the middle. That is, their use of theory varies quite a bit, going from extremely theoretical conditioning of the data, when they're building it, to very little. it speaks to your point about you know when I was computing, a scientific computation is AI. We can call it, it's all a part of the same larger corpus of techniques. It speaks to your argument that that we need to better understand how these data are interpreted through artificial intelligence. And so you can have, sort of particle physics is very, very theory heavy. And then you have other disciplines that are kind of lighter on theory, just for different reasons. So material sciences right now is a very machine learning base. And then you have disciplines like climate science, have been theory dominant for the last century, but now they're seeing the influx of coming into process, but it speaks to
It's only me that
like a black box, because it's not. It's very homogeneous and does different things. And then secondly, understand its effects on how data are constructed. And
Jonathan, your voice kind of goes in and out. I thought it was only me, but Jannis raising it now.
okay, I'm so sorry. Well, I kind of went along. Don't know if I should repeat myself, but the idea of how AI interprets data is fascinating in the world of science, because you have some disciplines that are highly based in theory, like theoretical physics, particle physics, and you have other disciplines, like, for example, right now, material sciences is doing a lot of machine learning stuff, which are very light on theory. And then you have disciplines like climate science, where have historically been theory intensive, but they're bringing a lot of machine learning techniques to come in and compensate for their limitations of the physics-based models that they have. And it's fascinating, but it does speak to your argument. I think that it would benefit us all to open the lid on AI and stop treating it like a homogeneous black single function one trick pony, because all these things really, really do condition the way the data are. First of all, data need to be generated, they're conditioned, they're filtered, they're cleaned, they're constructed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, what they mean and what theoretical apparatus they're situated in and how they should be interpreted. Right.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree, Jonathan, with what you say. I have several commentaries to make. One is that data and measurement are not the same things, and we sometimes conflate them.
Mm-hmm.
Data have also a component of what, not only how much. And that is important. It was an important part of my talk, but it was not explicit. But when we say that data filters of perception, they want to say, or media of perception, cognition, and communication, you suggest that data are more than measurement. And measurement is only one function of data. So this idea needs to be taken into account for the next commentary of mine. So part of what I've been trying to say is, once you've been cast into this game, your connection with the referential world into which you are active will change. How it will change depends very much on a different profession, on a different context. But many of the things you will do, they will be adjustments between data that you had last year and the data you need to have this year, and the technologies that you need to deal with this data. Which technological component is being missing? So there is a new dynamic that is being opened by what I have been described in my talk, from the early years, but even more as we arrive at this massive data generation and the development of technologies that need to interpret this data, which we ourselves cannot interpret. So there is a transposition of the dynamics between the data and the world they refer to into data with other data and with other technologies. That is important not to lose sight of. This differs between different contexts, but We should not lose sight, and we do lose sight of it very often. And it's an important aspect of what I have been trying to say. It may look a long way from generative AI to paper-based documents, but there is a line, Yiho, there is a line which I've been trying to describe in my talk, imperfectly perhaps.
Jiho does actually have a follow-up question, and as does Professor Swanson. So I'll, in that order, please.
No, I think Maha, please go ahead. You have questions too.
Oh, it's okay. I go at the end. That's fine. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just like
Maha
have
will challenge me on the entire frontier.
Yeah, my question was about this like homogeneity or the heterogeneity of data, because people now also talk about like how important it is to actually fine tune whatever like AI or machine learning models, so that with some like context specific data, so that they can be really useful for organizations or for whatever purpose, whatever goals you have. So this kind of like reminds me of like yes, the data are like they have the same form. They're harmonized in terms of the form because they're now all digitized. But still, it seems to me the data are not like totally removed from those contexts that they are generated from. So I just wanted to want you to give me some clarification on that point. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for pointing this out. It was perhaps a sort of limitation of mine that I didn't enter some of these details. Let me say, I think also what Bert Johnson said before about weaponization of data is also something which, for instance, is an heterogeneous practice. We didn't know about it before. It emerges along the way. But the two arguments are not the argument about homogenization of data and the heterogeneity of practices that data may support, not necessarily at odds. But what it does say is the following, and very briefly, that the once data are being abstracted by context, and also, if you want, by sense, and also, if you want, by interpretation, from their interpretation in the three stages I mentioned, context in paper-based, meaning or sense or semantic content in the era of digitization, and data interpretation in the age of AI. Whatever this homogenization happen doesn't say that what will happen in local context will be the same. It does make that claim. But it does say that what will happen in the local context and the production of heterogeneity, if you like, is conditioned by this journey of homogenization. And this is a distinct argument. And you will lose this conditioning, you will lose something important, because what is done in one AI context and in a different AI context are pretty different, but they have also some commonalities, which would be good for us to get to know, particularly if we speak about augmentation across contexts. What augmentation exactly? So that would be a very quick answer to you. So
Very clear. Thank you.
yeah.
We have Professor
I can make
Swanson.
the following point. Whenever abstraction occurs, recontextualization is more imperative. And this dialectic is always present. I didn't have much time to enter into this. It was not my main purpose. But some of these ideas you find also in some part of my empirical work with others. Yeah.
Professor Swanson and then Angela, and I think that might end up having to wrap it up. We may not have time beyond that, but Professor Swanson, please.
So I just have something of a comment. I'm not exactly sure how to frame this, but with regard to AI and the problem of data with regard to AI, isn't it the case that data is fundamental to computation in general? There is no computation without data.
Absolutely.
There can be data without computation, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
So in a way, data is primary. Computation and AI and everything we do with it just sort of follows on that in the important ways. So it's not entirely clear to me that AI presents a problem that hasn't been with us for a long time. Although clearly it
Yeah.
does after a fashion, but I'm not sure what it's a product of exactly, not necessarily the structure of AI. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Bert. You know better than me, presumably, the foundations of computing. Von Neumann, Shannon, and Weaver. That type of data is absolutely necessary for the computing machine to be invented and made working as a computing machine, right?
Right.
But that level of data is slightly different. We have different levels of data. From data that are arrived through piling and aggregation of a number of observations and describe semantically some aspect of the world. This data is a level above what you've been mentioned before. And this
I think actually, if I could jump in, I think actually I think all data has purported meaning. That's why we have metadata. There is also metadata tells us at any level in which we now compute it or aggregate it, it tells it alleges what it's supposed to be about, and it has a certain assertion of facticity in it.
I agree.
Right? And so I think it really does go way back. But I do agree that things are just much more
Let me
complex now.
refer. Yesterday, I commented on my old PhD of mine, and now professor assistant professor in Stevens, Alex Yaltonen. Some of you may know. He wrote a piece about bit strings on LinkedIn and the importance of an article by some guys, which is called Theorizing AI. Some of you may know, Faulkner and Runde. And he asked the question, and what is this, the importance of this for data? And he says, they speak about bit strings and everything they say is. And I replied to him that bit strings is the least important of data for social scientists. And I give you an example, Bert. If you train AI systems for object recognition, for example, you need label data that are carefully classified and labeled. Otherwise, you can't train the neural network to recognize that this is this shape and this is another shape. This is a cat and this is a lion. You need carefully and masses of carefully labeled and classified data.
I agree entirely.
Yeah. So what does that tell us? It tells us that data exists throughout these layered data infrastructures we speak about. And there are different types of data in which meaning and content are differently abstracted and made part of. And I think that when we speak about AI, we speak mostly about how using some of these lower level data to arrive at a higher level interpretations. And I know this is a very complete answer, but that would be my answer. And therefore, that there is, I mean, I can give you another example. Do I have the time? No.
No, it is absolutely fine as long as the audience is welcome and they are welcome to stay. We're good. Because we also
If I
have
give you an example of the level of translation machines, Bert, in the translation machines, you train a machine to recognize words as they occur in pairs in two languages, the source and the target language. And you want to let the machine learn about these pairs and how they statistically occur together, right? Now, these pairs of words don't exist, are not necessary for the functioning of the computing. The data that the computer needs are more fundamental in its nature. The von Neumann and Shannon foundations of computing. You should know better than me on this, and perhaps I'm not able to explain well. But this is another example that I will tell you about what different types of data we speak about when we develop AI systems.
Thank
Because
you.
pairs of words statistically occurring between two languages is a completely different type of data than the zeros and ones that the computer needs to operate. They will be reduced in the end into zeros and ones, you will tell me. Yes, it's still a different.
should we go to Angelo? Is that all right? Or perhaps, I don't know.
Yes,
if
thanks very
Angelo,
much.
if you wanted to step in, please. If you do have a response to Jannis, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll move to Angelo.
Okay. Hi, Jannis. Thanks again for the wonderful talk. I work with Jonathan mostly. And I just have I just wanted to ask for your thoughts on things. So the first is like one of our studies currently studying an AI startup that takes data from hospitals and then try to sell the model that they train there to other companies, to pharma companies. So I was just thinking what like in your mind, what's the relation between like data and the models that come out of it? Is there like a one-to-one relation? Or do you believe in this idea of emergence, that there's something that's distinct when we train a model from the data? So that's the first one. The second one, I'm just curious about your opinion on synthetic data. Like, how does it fit in your framework? Is that totally different because it's the machine itself that creates the new data? And so I was just curious about those two things.
Yeah, unfortunately, Angelo, you've been interrupted to me quite a bit, and Maha, can you translate the questions to me, perhaps? Because
Yes, so I'll
Okay.
read what Angela wrote. Angela, I hope that's a good representation of what you just said. He asked that if I missed this, and he apologizes, how are you thinking about the relation between data and AI? Specifically, in your view, are large language models creating emergent properties beyond what is in their training data? And the follow-up to that is, how do you then see synthetic data fitting into your framework of separations? Does it represent a fourth separation where AI systems can generate their own training examples without human intervention?
Yeah. On this last question, you will give me the freedom, Angela, to say that I'm not an expert about scientific knowledge and scientific data. And most of the data practices I spoke about are in the context of the economy and what we call organizations and expert practices. So experts are scientists, but expert practice is not the same as science, right? They are different. By which I mean medical doctors in healthcare is not the same thing as studying medicine. That's what I want to say. I can't answer into this question of yours. The first question was, Maha, remind me, because I'm getting tired, most
Yes,
probably.
sorry, and of course, he goes, how, in your view, are large language models creating emergent?
Emergent properties, yeah. There is a big debate about whether large language models will ever learn to develop a model similar to the one we have when we reevaluate experience and rehearse our understanding of the world on the basis of confrontation with the experience. And the dominant literature so far is that I think save computer people and the hype is that machines for the moment don't have these qualities. They don't have a model for interpreting the world. They have just interpretations of the world based on statistical, and some of the statistical relationships may be frequency, adjacency, may have some kind of emergent properties, but that doesn't change substantially anything I have been saying if you take the first part of my answer into your account, that the machine will never have a mind. They will never have in its own intelligence. It will perform calculations, thousands of them, computations, and very efficiently, and to some degree also in an admirable way. But it will not have a model of interpreting reality. This is euphemisms and an abuse of language, if you allow me to say. If you agree with me on this, you may not, it's legitimate. If you agree with me on this, then all these emergent properties, there may be ways of interpreting contingencies in the data, but not another way of understanding the data. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much to all of you. Jannis, I don't think there are any more questions, and I'm going to bug you with my questions later at some point rather than hold on to you right now where you might have some other things to do as well.
You don't want to give me a hard time.
Oh, no, I'm happy to give more time. I'm just a little worried now. I mean, basically, some of the things that I asked have been asked before by others as well. But I think there's a hard time. Jannis, you can answer any question, so that's not an issue. For me, the three separations were slightly tricky because they seemed linear to me, linear in the sense that you can't have the second without the first, and so much so that I couldn't see a difference between the first and the second, because the moment you remove data from a context, it loses its meaning anyway. So why are we discussing it as two separate? They don't come at separate points in time or with a new technology. For me, the moment the data is taken away from, I mean, I was thinking about Bruno Latour's work of Refern. Now I know, don't get mad at me. I know you don't really like his work, but seriously, I was just thinking about how we take representations of Amazon forest, we take a branch. The moment we take it out of its context, it loses its life, it loses certain things. But of course, it possesses certain kinds of understanding, sure, which I think with Jiho's and others' points as well.
But allow me to say the following then, to ask you back a question. Is there a difference between computers and paper-based documents? And how would you make the difference?
In how we can remodel the material in digital format and reuse in different ways, where we can do the same thing with paper, but to a lesser degree.
But what is the software? Then you don't reflect about the software. What is the software? There's no software in the first case. Certainly important losses of meaning and
but so does paper, Jannis. How can we argue that? Let's say I'm an investigator and you're giving me a report of an incident that you actually watched, and I'm asking you questions. I'm taking notes down. How I put that down into my report, into an objective, clear 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, everything that is in any way articulated, whether
you do this. You do this. In the software, the machine is doing this significantly in some ways, and this is an important difference. If you don't do this difference, you don't explain what computers do exactly that was not possible to do before. This is an important question, Maha. They do something, which is the magic of software we speak about. There is a
people are
magic.
different. But Jannis, people are different, right? We're all different. Some people are super
No,
intelligent.
no, this is getting away from the questions. We are not speaking about differences between people. This exists. We are all similar also, exactly copies of one another, as we're different.
Yeah.
So this doesn't lead us anywhere. But we need to explain the cultural presupposition by which paper-based documents were interpreted, which means that the actor was always doing this interpreting.
Even with knowledge management systems, or that's where you say it's already going into software?
Yeah, the knowledge management system in a paper-based world, yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
Then when digitization enters the stage, the creation of software is a way of inputting into a system, a mechanical system, some rules that previously were enacted by humans when they were interpreting paper-based documents. These rules are rules of processing mostly,
All right.
not rules of interpreting. Now, processing and interpreting, if you want to draw a line between these two, it's also difficult, I understand. But we need to make that, to have that difference clear. So
Okay, I take your point, but then how does AI change so much more than, let's say, a knowledge management system? A traditional, dull, something very old now.
because it interferes in what has been left untouched by technologies, which is to a significant degree how human medical experts, legal experts, lawyers, accountants, all sorts of experts, how they use this data to justify their decision and conduct their practices. Now, part of it, not all, in a little while, perhaps it will be all, but now part of it, significant enclaves of it, are being entrusted to AI-based systems that do the interpreting itself.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so this is the
Not in the
fundamental
legal system.
point
Yeah.
I've been trying to make.
It's a
And
difference
that's also,
who's doing the interpretation is
yeah,
what's.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, now I take your point. Then I accept it. Okay. But that was really good
You
fun.
don't
Thank
need to
you.
accept it, Mara, but
I
it's
miss this
good.
kind of conversation.
It's good also for the others that you give me the opportunity to explain these undeniably very slippery things.
Oh, but that was great. Seriously, thank you so much for your time. Thank you thank you to the audience for not just showing up, but staying on for a little bit longer than was expected. Thank you very, very much. It was a
Thank you,
really interesting
Maha.
talk.
Thank you, Maha, for inviting me. And thanks everybody that given these 2 hours of her or his time to listen to me. I'm really indebted.